Now Blaise is a VP and fellow at Google, where he's the CTO of Technology and Society. And he runs a very innovative group there called Paradigms of Intelligence, where they work on basic research in AI and related fields, the foundations of neural computing, active inference, sociality, evolution, and artificial life. The topic's closely related to his recent book, What is Intelligence? And I'm sure we'll hear a lot about this exciting work. So welcome, Blaise.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I want to talk. Well, I should say, these are the books that you just mentioned. There are actually two of them. It's sort of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So the What is Life book is chapter 1 of the What is Intelligence book, and they're both published by MIT Press. Originally I thought chapter 1 works as a standalone little book in its own right, and kind of went to town with my designer and unofficially printed it. But then MIT Press liked it a lot and decided that they would pick that one up as well. It's an homage to Erwin Schrödinger's What is Life book from 1943. There have been, I think, a couple of dozen books called What is Life, so it's in a not very exclusive club, to be honest. But it's really about theoretical biology and evolution, and as it turned out, that's an important perspective in thinking more broadly about intelligence, the way I've been thinking about it in recent years. So I'm gonna talk today about both perspectives, about the bottom-up life perspective and about a more top-down perspective on intelligence that maybe will be a little bit more familiar from computational neuroscience and AI, and hopefully have a couple of comments at the end about our current kind of AI moment and what those insights have to say about that. All right. So first of all, the old idea of life pre-enlightenment, let's say, was that we've all got souls or some vital spirit or elan vital that makes life alive, and that went out of fashion, of course, in the 19th century, and we began to talk instead about a very materialist perspective on what life is, that it's just about matter and about the physical interactions of matter. I'm pretty sure most of us in this room belong to this materialist tradition. We don't believe in supernatural forces that make things that are alive. But I also want to point out that there is a deep mystery in this materialist perspective, which is like, what makes things that are alive different in that case from things that are dead? Like, what do we even mean by alive if it's the same laws of physics for everything? And my answer is that it's function, that functionalism gives us the answer. And functionalism is a bit of a spooky thing. It actually has some dualistic-like properties, even though it is completely scientific. So, to illustrate what I mean, imagine that I come from the future with this object, and you ask me, what the hell is that thing? And I tell you, it's an artificial kidney. And if you implant it in a body, it has a 100-year lifespan, and it does all the things that kidneys are supposed to do. It filters urea and so on. So I've just told you important information, and it's life-saving if you have if you have kidney failure. But it's also not information that is in any way imminent in those atoms. They could be made out of tungsten filaments or out of carbon nanotubes or out of biological-like materials or who knows what. What I've told you is not anything about how that function is implemented, but about what the function is, which is to say how it would relate ecologically to the other parts of your body if implanted. So this functional statement is, very real, but it's also in some profound way non-physical. It goes beyond anything that reduces to what the kidney is made out of. So if we want to call a kidney, what it does, and thereby include, this kind of kidney and our kind of kidney as well, we are talking about something that is at some basic level non-material. And I'm going to argue that is basically computation. This functionalist perspective is the same one that Alan Turing held and elaborated. The whole idea of platform-independent or multiply realizable computation is that you can change around the platform any way you want. And when we define the function in mathematical terms of what it does, we have defined something at a higher level than exactly how it's implemented. And it can be implemented by anything that can do certain key operations. If it's Turing complete, then it can implement that function. Now, one of the key properties of functions, whether they're of kidneys or of Turing's kinds of functions, is that they are causal. and life is causal too. So you can't have a living system without having something like homeostasis, for instance, like you regulate your own temperature. And there is causality involved in that. The most trivial, regulating mechanism, as discussed by the cyberneticists in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, is the thermostat, in which you've got a switch that turns on and off the heat. In the old days, it was implemented with these mercury tilt switches, and the switch is both measuring a physical property, temperature. So the switch is connected to a spring that changes its tension based on this bimetallic temperature sensitivity, and it affects the temperature by turning on and off a heater that then changes that temperature. So that's a minimal computation. It's basically something that changes the world and an if-then statement. And you can't have a Turing-complete language without those two things. And there's causality implicit in this, right? It's not that the switch causes the temperature to change and the temperature causes the switch to turn, and it's only when both of those arms of the causal cycle are there that you have your cybernetic system. So you don't have cybernetics if you're just looking at the universe as a block universe, in which causality doesn't exist. So causality means A causes B, not A may or may not cause not B, but A causes B. That's not the same thing as correlation, right? So correlation means A and B co-occur, and not A and B co-occur with some statistically significant amount. That's not a causal statement. That's the kind of statement that would hold in a block universe, with or without time. You could think about correlations in an image, for instance, but there's no causation in an image. To have a causation, you have to have time that flows in one direction. You need an arrow of time, and that's really important because if you look at the fundamental laws that we know of physics, there's no arrow of time in any of these equations. So this is Newton's, Maxwell's, Einstein's, Schrodinger's quantum mechanics, relativistic quantum mechanics from Dirac. If you negate time in any of these equations, you have a symmetry, or up to the CPT theorem, charge parity. And so there's no arrow of time in physics, but there is an arrow of time in computation. How can that be, given that computation has to be implemented by a physical system? The arrow of time comes from the fact that computation involves writing things to the world causally and then having an if-then operation. And so any computation has this. If you look at the most minimal Turing-complete language that I know of, it's sublec, which is a one instruction set computer, one instruction set language. And the one instruction does both of these things. It modifies a value and it has an if-then in it. And that's hello world in sublec for anybody who cares. But I'm not fluent in sublec, so I'm going to move on quickly. There's been a lot of theory done. I think the best theory that I've seen about this is actually from Jordan Kotler in 2024, but I'm putting up this paper from 2023 because it has a diagram that I like, which shows you a physical system on the bottom that is evolving according to the laws of quantum mechanics or whatever it is, and on the top, a logical system that is evolving a computation. And the point is that in order to say a physical system computes, you have to have a mapping that maps from the physical system to the logical system and an inverse mapping that maps the other way. Those mappings have to be reasonably parsimonious. It doesn't work if the mappings grow infinitely complex over time, because then you could say any physical system computes anything. It could be the water in the Seine or whatever. But if you have parsimonious mappings, RT and RT twiddle, such that you can get general computation on the top, then you have a computer. And critically, the properties of the physical system on the bottom and of the computational system on the top are not the same. Most importantly, computation is not reversible, while the physics is reversible. Now, I'm in a computer science place. I'm sure you'll bring up reversible computation. Let's park it. In order to make reverse computation, you have to have ancillabits. In other words, you have to never erase your information. And that means that if you're doing a useful computation, you have to look at a smaller and smaller amount of what you're doing in order to consider the computation to be useful, which just means that you're still counting your exhaust. I think about it a little bit like those mites that live on people's faces that have no asshole. and so they like grow until they explode. Anyway, sorry, I'll move on. All right. So the irreversibility of computation brings with it thermodynamic implications. It means that that you need to erase bits. Therefore, you're reducing the phase space and the entropy of your system. Therefore, you must consume free energy. This is the Landauer principle. Okay, and my bigger point here is that causality makes no sense except in the light of computation. There is a way of thinking about what computation is that isn't maybe the way we usually think about it, which is that it's an engineering discipline that started in 1945, or maybe with Babbage and Lovelace in the 1800s. So I'd like for us to think, to shift our perspective on computation and think about it instead as a natural science. And it's the natural science that comes into the picture the moment we begin talking about causality in physical systems. So, computation is the science of causality. Hector Zenil, who has done a lot of work on Kolmogorov complexity, I think has a very similar perspective on this. So causality starts to bring us a little bit closer to ideas like purpose, agency, maybe even intelligence. This is relevant to questions about AI, agents, and many other things. If a boulder is rolling down a hill, that's causal. If there is a car at the bottom of it, it's going to get squashed. But I don't think that any of us would hold that the boulder has, intentions or is an agent here. There's only agency in this picture if somebody pushed the boulder at the top of the hill. So something additional has to be added to just this question of causality in order for us to get to purpose or agency or intelligence. And I'd like to now delve into a little bit how such purposiveness or agency comes about. How does that come about in a world governed by pure physics? Well, I think that there's a very interesting fable that can give us some insight into this. It comes from James Lovelock, the originator, along with Lynn Margulis, of the Gaia hypothesis. This paper is about Daisy World. He published it, I think, in 1983 with A.J. Watson. And the setup is as follows. You have a planet just like the Earth, so same kind of distance from its star, but it only has two species on it. These are white daisies and black daisies. They both have an optimal reproductive temperature of 72 degrees. So, like the temperature in this room. And if the temperature deviates from that, then their reproductive rate drops off and goes to zero, if it's too far outside the sweet spot. And what Lovelock asked is, in a world with those two kinds of daisies on it, what happens with the temperature of the planet if one varies the luminosity of the star that's heating that planet up? The reason that this question is relevant is because black daisies, of course, absorb photons and heat the planet up. White daisies increase the albedo of the planet, reflect light, and therefore cool the planet down. And you get something really cool, which is that just with the dynamics of white daisies and black daisies, you get homeostasis. The planet keeps its temperature right in that sweet spot for reproduction of the daisies over a factor of more than 2 in solar luminosity. So the plot on the bottom shows you the way that such a planet will regulate its temperature, over a factor of 2 in solar luminosity to make it sweet for the daisies. And the way it does that is by varying the proportion of black and white daisies in order to maintain homeostasis. Now, this looks really weird. It's very mysterious if you look at it from a dynamical systems perspective. But if you look at it from an evolutionary or niche shaping perspective, it doesn't look so weird. Because basically what this system is thermostats. There are a bunch of thermostats that are able to modify their environment by being black or white, and that have a particular region of that environment in which they can continue to exist. And whenever those conditions obtain, there's going to be a selection pressure, an evolutionary selection pressure for those things that homeostat their environment to be in the condition where they can continue to exist. And this is quite a general result. It doesn't rely on the details of Lovelock's particular setup. So you can think of this as evolutionary cybernetics. If you've got, say, a bunch of chemical processes going on in a solution, and only if the pH is such and such can they continue to happen. but they also modify the pH of their environment. Well, wait a while, and the chemical processes that will survive are the ones that regulate the pH of that environment to be where they need to be in order for those reactions to happen. It's almost tautological. So, basically, what persists exists, and what exists is what has persisted, which is to say, what can, what is still living in the environment that it is helping to create. Everything that can modify its environment creates the environment in which it can continue to exist, or else it's not going to still be around. That's really all it is. There's a corollary here, which is that life creates the environment for life, and I think it's quite a deep, if very simple, again, almost tautological point. So, is this purposive or agential? Maybe it's the beginnings of it, and it also, by the way, is a computation, right? So that's exactly the modify the environment and if and then of a thermostat. Now, I'd like to shift gears and talk about this in terms of embodied computation. This is a move that von Neumann made, some years after Turing's original formulation of the Turing machine. So for Turing, computation was done by a head that moves left and right along a tape and reads and writes symbols to that tape according to a table of rules. But the key point is that it's disembodied in the sense that the tape and the head are not made out of the same stuff as the symbols. So, in a universal Turing machine, a program can copy itself, but the machine itself can't copy itself, right? So it's like a laptop, but not like a laptop hooked up to a 3D printer that can print another laptop. Now, von Neumann's version of computation, which is cellular automata, is more like the laptop plus 3D printer. So you can make a computer in a cellular automaton universe, which has physics that describe how a cell evolves based on the values of its neighboring 8 cells. And if you build a computer in such a universe, the symbols that are read and written are the same stuff as the computer itself, and therefore you can make a computer reproduce. And this is actually why von Neumann came up with cellular automata in the first place. He was trying to understand how life is possible. So he was asking the same question as Schrödinger when he wrote his What is Life book in the 1940s, and he did this work in the 1940s as well with Stan Ulam at Los Alamos. And his question was, how is it possible for a robot made out of Legos that is paddling around in a pond with loose Legos in it to somehow assemble those Legos into a copy of itself, which is obviously what every cell has to do, what every mother has to do. There's something weirdly paradoxical about that idea. And his insight was, well, there's nothing paradoxical about it if you have inside yourself a tape with instructions for how to build a me. And you have what he called a universal constructor, a machine that can march along on that tape and put the parts together according to the instructions on the tape. And you have a tape copier that can copy the tape. And the instructions for building the universal constructor and the tape copier are themselves on the tape. If all of those conditions hold, then you have a robot that can build more robots like itself. The kicker is that the universal constructor is a universal Turing machine. So in other words, it's not possible to have a system that reproduces without it being at its core a computational system, literally a Turing universal computer. Again, there are asterisks about universality versus finite or bounded universality. Yes, but let's not get too hung up on it for now. It's profound because it says that life is computational. Also, by the way, von Neumann was right about DNA. Right, there really is such a tape. Remember this? He came up with this before Watson and Crick's 1951 paper. Also before we had discovered ribosomes, which are exactly the universal constructor. Also before we had discovered DNA polymerase, which is the tape copier. And of course, the instructions for building ribosomes and DNA polymerase are indeed on DNA. So he got it exactly right from pure theory without ever having set foot in a biology lab, which makes him a pretty awesome theoretical biologist in my view. Okay, so we did a little bit of work in my team. I began this about 2 years ago to explore some of these ideas in practice, and I just want to show you a little bit of how that work works. So this is sort of our foray into artificial life, so this paper is not up on arXiv yet, but will be soon, I hope. First of all, it makes use of a minimal Turing complete language called brainfuck, which some of you may have heard of. It was invented by Urban Müller, name is not mine, in the 1990s. He was an amateur juggler and physicist at a Swiss university, I believe. And so, I continue to use it because I am secretly 12 years old. But also because brainfuck is a minimal programming language that looks very Turing machine-like. So it's got only 8 instructions. The instructions are, move the head 1 step to the left, move the head 1 step to the right, increment the byte under the head, decrement the byte under the head. That's 4. We're already halfway to the end. The other instructions are, input and output, and jump operations. That depending on the whether the value under the head is 0 or non-zero, you jump to the matching open bracket or close bracket. That's it. That's the whole thing. And you can write, Windows or Linux in that or whatever else with enough patience. All right. So the BFF experiment, as I call it, where the first BF stands for brainfuck, and the second F stands for friend or for fuck, it goes as follows. You begin with a soup of tapes of brainfuck tapes, and that soup, each tape is of fixed length. It's of length 64, and it begins random, just random bytes. Now, keep in mind that if there are random bytes of length 64, that means that only a couple of them, on average, are going to be one of those 8 instructions, and the rest of them will be no-ops, meaning that the head will just jump right over them when these things run. And then the procedure is really, really simple. It just consists of taking 2 of the tapes out of the soup, joining them end to end, so concatenating them, and running, and then pulling them back apart and putting them back in the soup and repeating. And that's it. That's the whole thing. So that's the BFF experiment. And you do that a few million times and see what happens. So I'll show you what happens. That's my laptop running it. And in the beginning, nothing much appears to happen, but then something magical happens, which is that you get complicated programs emerging seemingly out of nothing. I forgot to mention, but I also, because I was assuming that mutation would be really important here, there's also a mutation rate. So maybe 1 in 10,000 times a byte changes to something random. And so, lo and behold, from nothing but random noise, you get these, rather complex programs that take quite a lot of reverse engineering coming out of nothing. There's been no explicit selection pressure. I'm not asking them to do anything, but sure enough, they do something. What are they doing? Well, they are definitely reproducing. We know that they're reproducing because you get lots of copies of all of these, although it never, or at least for a reasonable size of soup, it never devolves into all of those tapes being identical, which is interesting and important. So there's a kind of ecology of tapes that appear to be copying each other and themselves in some way. So this is the initial state, right? So random bytes, and only 1 out of 32 of those bytes are instructions, and only about 2 operations execute per interaction. And then after, in this case, 5 million interactions, you've got code, and there's a lot more bytes in there that are instructions, and more than 1,000 operations per interaction. So this soup has become highly computational. Why? Well, because if something can reproduce, it will continue to exist. And if something cannot reproduce, then it will be overwritten by something that can. So what I'm saying is that life is a more stable form of matter than non-life. Now, there are caveats to this. How is that compatible with the second law of thermodynamics? Well, you need an input of free energy to make this work, right? There's computation happening here, so you need to be able to reduce the entropy. But if you are able to reduce the entropy, if there's some gradient in your environment, some source of free energy, then these cycles that involve self-construction or autopoiesis are more stable than things that are not. And in a way, it's just a generalization of the second law of thermodynamics beyond fixed points and into cycles that are causal and active. So there are some powerful generalizations, I think, of thermodynamics to these dynamical cases that are still under theorized. We're working on it. There's some others as well who are doing this. This is what that looks like, that phase change between non-life and life. So there are 10 million dots on this plot. Each dot is an interaction. X-axis is time, and the y-axis is number of operations that took place in that interaction. And what you can see is that not much is happening in the first 6 million interactions, and then at 6 million, suddenly the amount of computation jumps up in a very dramatic way, and suddenly there's a ton of computing happening. It looks like a phase change, and it also looks like a phase change if you measure the entropy of the soup. So here I'm just zipping the soup. You can use your compressor of choice. This one is LZMA2, and basically it's incompressible in the beginning, meaning that it's random. Every byte is uncorrelated from everything else, and the entropy suddenly and precipitously drops dramatically. Not to nothing, right? There's still variation among those tapes, but it drops to a much lower value right at that moment when the computation shoots through the roof. And we know it has to do that because they're reproducing. So that means that in any dictionary-based compression or anything like it, you'll find copies of stuff. So what do we call the phase of matter on the left? That one is gas, basically. It's what Walter Fontana called Turing gas, right? Uncorrelated bytes. And the phase of matter on the right is not a familiar one. It's not a gas or a liquid or a plasma or a solid. I would call that phase of matter life. It's different than the other phases of matter because it has structure at all scales. It's not a fractal, it's not self-similar, it's self-dissimilar across scales. But essentially there is information. There's algorithmic information at every scale. And that's a phase of matter that, again, I don't think has been properly theorized, but it's the one that we're made out of. Okay, so the moral is that in pretty much any universe that has a source of randomness and can support computation, if this is to be believed, life will evolve just for thermodynamical reasons. But there are a couple of deep mysteries here, and one of them is that you may have noticed when I ran that the programs became more complex as they went on, and that seems like a bit of a mystery because once they're able to reproduce, you would think like it's done, but it wasn't done. And the other thing is, how on earth did that happen in the first place? Actually by accident in the beginning, because I was trying sweeps for varying mutation rate to find what the optimal mutation rate was to get life to evolve. If you move the mutation rate down to 0, life still evolves. And that is weird, right? Because in standard Darwinian evolution, what we imagine to be the case is that it's throwing spaghetti against the wall. You need random mutations, and then whatever sticks, and it's a kind of optimization or gradient descent problem. But that doesn't work here at all. It doesn't work for multiple reasons. One of them is that these programs are not a smooth space. So you can't really go down a gradient. If you break any of the bytes in those programs, the whole program breaks. So that's weird. And the other one is that if you set the mutation rate to 0, you still get the evolution of these programs, and that's even weirder. So why is that? What's going on? Well, I think that the answer actually comes from Lynn Margulis, from Lovelock's partner in crime on the Gaia hypothesis. She was also the biologist who showed in 1966 that mitochondria were originally free-floating bacteria and got incorporated into something like an archaea cell to make eukaryotes. She followed some earlier researchers, Konstantin Merezhkovsky especially, in calling that symbiogenesis. She believed that symbiogenesis, which is to say the combination of pre-existing life into new life, was the driving force behind evolution. Even though biologists eventually all bought the idea that mitochondria were once free-floating, still by the end of her life in 2011, it was still very much not mainstream biology to believe that symbiogenesis is a driving force of evolution in general. But that was her belief, and I think that she's right about it. And I'll give you some evidence that that's happening in BFF. So what would symbiogenesis look like in BFF? Well, one way that we might look for it is by looking for replicators that emerge before the whole tapes begin replicating. And when you look for those, you find them. So the most trivial replicator is just a single byte, a single instruction that, if there's a single instruction, it might change a value somewhere else in the tape, and that the new value might be the same byte that actually did the change, right? So it's possible for there to be 1-byte replicators in there to begin, and sure enough, there are 1-byte replicators in there to begin. And when you look at the populations of these replicators, you see that there are more and more of them, and their rises and falls are faster and faster until you get to, in this case, this magic moment at around 3.8 million interactions, where suddenly there's only one that takes over. So it appears when you look at these things that there are actually lots of replicators, and when you look more closely, you begin to see that these replicators are combining. So in other words, single bytes are weakly, occasionally copying themselves, and then once in a while they come into conjunction, and then those two bytes copy themselves better than the one, and then those things will come together with something else. So in other words, you can define a merger tree in which sub-replicators combine together to make bigger replicators, and what we're actually seeing is fusion, a sort of a cascade of fusions that in the end result in this complex full tape replicator. Please.
You had said even without mutation, we're getting this. Is there a difference in how much the mutation rate was in terms of the speed? Like mutation,
basically, a little bit of mutation makes it go faster, and too much mutation then makes it go down again. So there's an optimum, but you still get the same phenomenon at zero, which is the weird thing. Now, okay, so let's talk a little bit about how one might theorize this symbiogenesis stuff. So, in looking for a way to mathematize it, the place that I ended up going was the mathematical physicist Marian Smolchowski, in also another early 20th century Eastern Bloc fellow, who developed the theory of coagulation. So coagulation is the process by which monomers clump together to form dimers, which then clump together to form trimers and quadrimers and so on. This is the process whereby scabs form, whereby jello sets in the fridge, whereby clouds form into raindrops. So it's the dynamics of aggregation. And there's a phase transition that occurs when things aggregate together, which is called gelation. Basically, when things clump together according to some kernel, K, there are properties of the scaling of that kernel as a function of how big the things are that go in, such that below some scaling exponent, you don't get a phase transition, and above it, you get a critical time, a finite time phase transition to an infinite size clump, which is exactly what happens when you make jello. And that's exactly what's happening here too. This is a gelation phase transition. If I try to go into all of the math of that now, I'm not going to have time to talk about AI, so I'm going to skip a little bit through that. But I do want to show you some key insights from that analysis. One of them is that I've talked about byte replicating itself, but that's actually not quite what is generally happening with those very early replicators. When we look for an early replicator for replicating bytes, I should say that for me, a replicator just means a byte that gets copied. Does that mean that the byte is copying itself? Not necessarily, right? It could be an instruction somewhere else that is copying that byte. And that's, of course, almost always the case. Something is not self-contained. It doesn't copy itself in the beginning. So one can call something that, whereby the thing that gets replicated is completely disjoint from the code that is doing the replication. One could call that inanimate, right? Kind of like the way water molecules are inanimate. They get generated by processes, right, elsewhere, but they're not copying themselves. If there's an overlap between the code that is doing the copying and the thing that is copied, but the thing that is doing the copying is not fully contained by what is copied, you could call that viral. Now, I'm putting big scare quotes around this, right? But what I mean is that some of the replication machinery is included in what is being replicated, but not all of it. It's not self-sufficient. And if the replication code is entirely contained by what is being copied, you could call that cellular. Again, scare quotes. But what I mean is that all of the machinery, you get von Neumann's condition, all of the machinery doing the copying is part of what is being copied. And what I'm showing you here is that if you normalize a whole bunch of runs to 1.0, the time of gelation, right at the end, cellularity takes off. So what we're really looking at, this gelation phase transition, is the transition to cellularity or complete self-replication. What's happening before that is that you don't really have things that are capable of replicating themselves, but rather of replicating each other in complex symbiotic loops, right? So A might help out B, which helps out C, which makes more of A, and so on. Please.
Yeah, so I was wondering, like you have the virality there and you have the cellular. Do you see also like in biology where the viruses take advantage of the cellular mechanisms to kind of replicate themselves? Because you show the virality crashes all the way to zero. So I was interested why you don't evolve a steady state equilibrium between the viruses taking advantage of that.
It's a good question. And that is, I think that's, my scare quotes are not fully scare quotes because I do think there's an analogy with biology here. The reason that in the very simplified universe of BFF, you don't get, viruses after gelation is just because the environment is fixed. So everything is a tape of length 64. And, so when things clump together or gelate, given enough energy for the entire tape to replicate, the entire tape will replicate. But that's not generally true. You can't have things of infinite size replicating themselves fully in the real world. And so you get a whole spectrum of different forms of replicators from the full, that include viral ones. But the broader point that, right, could symbiosis or symbiogenesis specifically have been the way that even simple things like bacteria emerged on Earth? I think the answer is yes. There are at least some molecular biologists like these folks, Catherine Lanier, Anton Petrov, Laurentine Williams, who have theorized that the central dogma of biology, which is this idea that that DNA gets transcribed into RNA, which then gets translated into proteins, that this was essentially a this is the fossil evidence of an ancient symbiosis or symbiogenesis, in which originally these three things, through some indirect means, were able to replicate themselves. And it's when those things combine that you get self-contained bacterial self-replication. This view of life is, I think, the right one, and I think it's very different from the one in which we imagine that things have to be RNA first or have to be metabolism first or whatever. Effectively, this is saying everything is first, and life comes about through the braiding together of these different things that independently can weakly somehow get more of themselves to happen. And so talking about single origins doesn't even make any sense when you start looking at things through the symbiogenic lens. Yes.
What are the indications for you to say BFF has agency? Like,
Haven't claimed it.
you haven't got, okay.
No, although I will say that it does seem to have something like purposiveness, if what we mean is that it can break, right? So for me, one of the ways of thinking about purpose is that when you look at a complex piece of code, right, that all fits together just so, and where if you make a modification, it no longer functions, right? We're saying that it functions, it does something. That's purposive. Now, whether that means it has agency, I think maybe is a little bit more of a philosophical question, but purposiveness means it does something. If you have a rock and you break it in half, you don't have a broken rock, you just have two rocks now, right? But a kidney, if you damage it, right, you now have a non-functioning kidney. So to me, that's purpose. Okay, so you can mathematize everything that I've just been describing. So basically, ordinary replication and competition for niches, you can think about as a term R in a dynamical system. And symbiogenesis, following Smolhovsky, you can mathematize as a term K for things coming together. The left-hand side is normal population dynamics, like the Lotka-Volterra equations, or many others that have been written in chemical kinetics and in evolutionary biology. And the right-hand side is this more discrete, contingent, symbiogenesis term, wherein things come together and make new things. The left-hand side is continuous, the right-hand side is discontinuous. The left is evolution, the right is revolution. And the point really is that you can't get origins of life or complexification of life without the right-hand side. The left-hand side is closed-ended, the right-hand side is open-ended. That's the key thing. Now, if in BFF you knock out the right-hand side, you knock out symbiogenesis, and you can do this by just saying, when we combine our tapes, we can look to see if a new replicator emerges and then decide whether we want to accept that interaction. And if a new replicator emerges that breaks whatever rule we want, we can say, let's pretend that didn't happen, put them back in the soup and try again. So you can do this ablation with the BFF system, and you get results that look like these. So these are ablations of the depth of the tree. So in other words, we allow merger trees to happen only up to a depth of 9, for instance. If you do this, then the result is that gelation never occurs. So you have to have quite deep trees before gelation will happen. In other words, quite a few things have to combine at a bunch of levels, at least a dozen levels, until you get something complex enough to do cellular self-replication. And if you block trees of that high depth from occurring, you won't get this phase transition. Instead, you get still a pretty random-looking soup, like what is on the right. That's interesting. And what's also interesting is that those events that where things combine into high depth, more complex objects, they're rare. So blocking those things only requires blocking maybe 1 in 1,000 interactions. But it's those critical 1 in 1,000 interactions that result in the formation of something novel and complex that are what drive evolution in the system. Now, when you impose one of those blocks and you knock out K, or you knock out K partially, what you get is a population of replicators that just follow a sigmoid trajectory and saturate at some level. And these are weaker replicators that are not cellular. You can then do something fun, which is fluctuation analysis out of these populations, and thereby you can reverse engineer the left-hand term R. So if you look at these populations, you can see right away that some of them look like they are positively correlated with each other, like the blue guy and the green guy in the middle of the screen, you can see kind of rise and fall sort of together. But there are other ones that are anti-correlated with each other. So, you can do a little analysis and measure the correlations in these populations and back out of that a replication matrix. And when you do that, you get matrices that look like this. So, the rows and columns here are replicator species. And what you see is, for one thing, a very strong diagonal. That tells you that things are replicating themselves effectively. There is self-replication here. But you also see things off the diagonal. And in particular, you see both positive and negative values off the diagonal. The negative values are competition. So that's situations where two replicators are trying to replicate into the same bytes, and therefore they compete, right? They're in the same niche, and so they trade, one's win is the other's loss. But you also see, and by the way, you see that those negative terms are roughly symmetric. So if A competes with B, B competes with A too, because they're generally in the same niche. But the positive values don't follow any particular pattern. So that's the stuff on the right. And those are complex. Just because A helps B doesn't mean that B helps A. A might help B, B might help C, C might help D, D might come back around and help A a little bit, right? It's an ecology. It's a complex ecosystem or web of helping. And so in negative component is symmetric, positive off-diagonal component is asymmetric, complex life cycles, cooperation. And if you clamp the depth ceiling at different values, what you find is that cooperation becomes stronger and stronger. And that's actually what is driving the phase transition. So in other words, you can see when symbiogenesis is about to happen because symbiosis is already happening. Things are helping each other and then they merge. And you can see that when you look at the eigenvalues of the Jacobian at this in this stable condition. So it's a really, really fun result, and it tells you that the R and the K are not independent; they're related. The helping is basically a signal that those things might incipiently join forces and become a unit, and then thereafter only be found together. So symbiosis precedes symbiogenesis. And in a way, symbiogenesis is almost just a relabeling, right? If A and B are helping each other, and eventually they're helping each other so much that they always co-occur, in a way, we're just saying, well, we're going to label A and B now as a new species. Now it's not quite just a relabeling, because sometimes one of them will get partially overwritten by the combination. The combination doesn't have to look like the algebraic sum of the two, but to first order, it's kind of a relabeling in the same way that Lynn Margulis used to talk about people as being just bags of bacteria. And I might go even further and say that bacteria are in turn bags of viruses. So we're just bags of viruses that happen to reproduce jointly. Okay, so symbiogenesis gives you complexification over time. And that in turn gives evolution an arrow of time. It tells you why life forms become more complex over time, right? A and B know how to replicate themselves. When they join together, they have to know how to replicate together. And that's additional algorithmic information, which is then fossilized, and then the process repeats. So this is why, when Stephen Jay Gould said bacteria are just as evolved as people, we've all been around for the same 3 billion years. Of course, that's not true. People have not been around for 3 billion years, and they're not, and bacteria are not just as evolved, right? The fact that they're still around, ones that haven't banded together to become people, right, is interesting and important. But also, people are fundamentally more complex than bacteria because we're bacteria that have learned how to work together, and that there's extra information in the working together bit. All right, so Joris Sathmari and John Maynard Smith, the evolutionary biologists, sort of wrote a little bit about this theory of major evolutionary transitions, in which they describe, in their original Nature paper in 1995, 8 moments when major symbiogeneses resulted in greater complexity in life on Earth. They're right, but I think their list is not just a few too short, and they've added, maybe 4 or 5 to this list since 1995, but way too short. I think that they're only looking at the tip of a gigantic iceberg, and it's kind of symbiogenesis all the way down. I don't want to yeah, I'm running very short on time, so I'll just say, when you look at our own genome, you see evidence of much, much, much more symbiogenesis than that. One way to understand that is that only 1.5% of our genome codes for proteins, and the rest of it, is so-called junk DNA. Not really junk, of course. A bunch of it is regulatory, but even accounting for that, there's a lot of stuff in here that is mysterious, and in fact, a tremendous amount of it is viral or transposons or retrotransposons. In other words, are entities that replicate themselves at the subgenome level. Lines, signs, LTR retrotransposons, DNA transposons, all of those are bits of viral code that have fused into the human germline at some point. And in many cases, these things have replicated in other germlines as well. A quarter of the cow genome is a single transposon BOV-B, which also occurs in lizards and a bunch of other species. I just ran across a paper last week that myelination in us apparently comes from a viral endogenization that happens many tens of millions of years ago in our lineage. The hypothesis here basically is that mutation is really just a minimal symbiogenetic event. You can think of it as, right, where you have a single random non-replicating thing that can only replicate in the context of a larger organism that kind of pops out of nowhere. But more often, you get things that are longer and that already know how to do something and end up being incorporated into genomes. And it's these functional compositions that are the big driver.
Thank you very much. So basically, my question is very quick. I just wanted to know, so then mutation in this system or sort of set of processes replaces intention in a way?
Well, a single base pair mutation, the simplest kind of mutation where just a point change, there's no intention in that, right? We assume that it's just random noise, just like the initial bytes in the BFF soup. But if what has been inserted is a piece of code from a retrovirus, for instance, then it's certainly purposive, right? I mean, not to say that it's planned out, like everything that's going to happen thereafter, but it is functional, right? It's evolved to be stable and to do something. And really, my point is just that when things have already evolved to be stable and do something, then they're a lot more powerful as change agents in what results. For instance, the placental barrier in humans was formed by a virus that fuses cell membranes together, and it does that as part of the life cycle of the virus that it originally came from. So that purpose, there's an acceptation process there. It got repurposed to do something else, which is the mother-baby barrier. So in this view, life is embodied autopoietic computation arising and complexifying through symbiogenesis. So it's a very different view of life from the mainstream one, I would say. And it implies a bunch of really interesting things, like it's not just neuroscience that's computational. It's all of life that was computational from the very beginning. And it gets more computationally complex over time through symbiogenesis at many scales. And symbiogenesis makes that computation massively parallel, right? When you have two things that are both computers and they start to work together, what you now have is a parallel computer. So there's a sort of Moore's law at work here, where greater symbiogenesis makes up more and more parallel computation as life complexifies. And that's really interesting because cooperative computational parallelism enables collective intelligence via a division of cognitive labor. When you look at all of these scaling laws that have become now very popular in AI land, where we see that bigger and bigger neural nets can do more and more intelligent things, right? Those kind of scaling laws are paralleled by scaling laws, by social scaling laws, for instance, that societies with larger and larger numbers of people are more and more collectively intelligent, right? Inventive, et cetera. Or the fact that individual brains are made out of cortical columns, and as they grow, the individual animal becomes more and more intelligent. So whether you're looking at brains, societies, AI models, or societies of AI models, right, you find the same sorts of scaling laws that all arise from parallelization of computation and division of labor among those parallel computers. And there's a connection between that and this fundamental symbiogenetic process that just arises from physics, from the physics of computation. Okay, now I think I better stop here because I've already covered a lot, and I'm sure that there are more questions. But maybe I'll just point out one more thing before stopping, which is that we have the illusion of things like consciousness and selfhood being that we're a one unified self, that we have this unity of ourselves and of our experience. And I want to point out that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that that is not the case. Some of that evidence comes from, for instance, split brain patients. If you have electrical storms, if you have epilepsy and it's intractable and it spreads from one hemisphere to the other one of the last ditch cures for that is to cut through the corpus callosum and divide the two hemispheres from each other. And when you do that, you end up with, let me just show you a little bit of video to give you a sense. You end up with.
Joe, I'm going to show you some things. I just want you to tell me what you see. And here we go. You ready? Look right at the dot. Okay. Right. Okay, you ready? Look right at the dot. Grapes. Good. When Joe focuses on a point, right at the dot, everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech. Right at the dot. So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture, Joe is easily able to name it. There we go. See it. Close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work here. Okay, what do you got there? Okay, very good. Left brain. What did you see? So just close your eyes and draw with your left hand. Just let it go. It's nice. What's that? Slow. Yeah. What did you see, Cameron? What'd you draw that for? I don't know.
Right. So, both halves of his brain are having experiences, are conscious, are able to do, high order processing, but, he's only speaking from the left hemisphere. That's where speech is generated in his case. So it's not conscious of what's going on the right-hand side. Does that mean the right-hand side is not conscious? No, of course not. It just means that there is, if you like, an illusion of unity. And the thing that I've always found most striking about split brain patients and their accounts is what Joe describes here.
Our left hemisphere and right hemisphere now are working independent of each other, but you don't notice it. Now you just kind of adapt to it. It doesn't, you don't have any feeling any different than it did before.
Right. Basically, you cannot get anybody with a split brain to admit that there are two people in there. And it turns out you can do experiments with people without split brains that induce the same sorts of effects. This is called choice blindness for anybody who is interested. But basically, we are all, parts, and it's very easy to induce situations that will show you the disunity of the self. And yet at the same time, obviously, those are parts that, like a rowing crew, are in really good sync generally, and they work like a team, right? And create a self, if you like, out of those parts. I hesitate to call it an illusion because, an illusion means that there is a reality that is different from the illusion. And in my view, this is the reality, right, of what selves are. So, okay, I'm going to stop there and maybe switch to discussion in our last few minutes.
Great insights. What does this mean for symbiogenesis, for LLMs and the activation functions, backpropagation, loss functions? They're all hit the limits?
Yeah, there's a whole book about this called "What is Intelligence," in which I've tried to answer the question. So it's a little hard for me to answer quickly, but I will say this. My view of technology as a whole is that it is part of this same trajectory. You can look at examples, that are historical or much older technologies like the steam engine and internal combustion. This is a really cool economics paper from earlier this year, from 2025, Buscas et al. And what they're showing is that from the year 1250, from the Middle Ages up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we are stuck in this Malthusian trap in which, the human population cannot exceed 1 billion. When population declines because of Black Death, wages go up and vice versa. There's just like we are energy limited in such a way that, we're stuck in this oscillation. The moment we begin to do internal combustion and the Industrial Revolution takes off, we escape from this state. In the beginning, just with population, and then with both population and quality of life. This is basically like the endosymbiosis of mitochondria, right? We make steam engines. Everybody knows that people make steam engines, but what I don't think people appreciate is that steam engines make us too. The only reason there are 8 billion people, or however many people there are on Earth now, is because 7 billion of them were made by steam engines. And so there's a kind of right? And yes, they can't reproduce themselves, but neither can a kidney, right? There's an ecological system of relations there. So anyway, you asked about LLMs, not about steam engines, but my point is that I think LLMs are a part of human intelligence. If we think about human intelligence in more holistic terms, not as just what an individual brain can do, but what a scaled up society does, a lot of it is already technological. We're not a technological species, and we've been, deeply technological for 200,000 years, and especially for the last 10,000, and especially the last 200. And the fact that now some of these, symbionts, if you like, are computational, can do thinking as well as metabolism, that obviously poses a lot of deep philosophical questions for us, but I don't think it's fundamentally different from what's been happening all along.
Thanks for the excellent talk. So maybe the LLM were really inspired by human. However, the current aggressive progress of AGI will really cause some threat to human. Like in the latest last week, the latest Black Hat security conference, they hacked the robotic AI on site, and it was just a virus hack in the beginning. So far, right? But with agentic AI, the robot will hack, will really go to attack another robot and also human on site. So I'm saying that if we don't do anything with the concentrate AGI without human, that AGI version, it could largely impact our human intelligent progress or even kill us. Can you comment on this? Thank you.
So I'm not here to give a Pollyanna, like everything is fine, don't worry talk. I am concerned about some of the things that you're talking about, and also about, things that about, for instance, whether the economy that we've built and the political systems that we've built are compatible with the way, things are going to work once, agentive AI, becomes able to do, long time scale tasks reliably, for instance. So, there are lots of risks that we have opened to ourselves and to each other with our technologies. And again, that's true of internal combustion as well, and of nuclear weapons, and of a variety of other things that we've done in the last couple of 100 years. And I think research in that area is really, really important. I also think, though, that, and I should say also, symbiosis doesn't always mean everything is nice and sweet for everything involved. There are aggressive symbioses that result in, let's say, one of the parties that joins into that agreement getting the short end of the stick. So, it's not that everything is going to be fine. It's more that a lot of the stories that I hear from AI doomers, sorry to use that somewhat pejorative term, but a lot of it feels to me like it's based on an idea about what evolution is and how it works that is deeply incomplete, and that doesn't take account of the fact that the driver of evolution is cooperation at least as much as it is competition, and that it's not the case that more intelligent species dominate less intelligent species, et cetera. Like that's not actually an accurate representation of how life on Earth has progressed up to this point. It's not even accurate to say that humans are are dominating wheat. Like there are accounts in which wheat dominates humans. There's a wonderful book called Against the Grain by an agrarian philosopher and an economist that I think is very, very good. So it's more complicated story than a lot of either AI safety or AI risk people, sort of present it as. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing that research. It's really important.
Can you say a little bit about how you understand the role of exogenous events and the story you tell about evolution here, whether for humans and or for computational systems?
What do you mean by exogenous?
Asteroid strikes, wide-scale climate change that lead to massive transformations of life as we know it. How do these exogenous shocks, call them, fit into the story, if at all?
Well, a really big exogenous shock, like a Theia-sized asteroid hitting the Earth, would just wipe everything out, and it's game over. Greater and greater intelligence gives entities the ability to predict and handle, disturbances that are more and more complex and farther off, right? So if an asteroid was heading for the Earth 200 years ago, the Earth wouldn't have had a chance. Now, the Earth has a chance because, we'd spot it with our telescopes and we'd probably mobilize and try and do something. So you could see that as the Earth itself becoming more intelligent, as a function of, the neural net that is humans, right, operating as part of that larger system. Also, when you look at that equation, the R and K equation, the thing that you notice is that the R part can be modeled as an ODE, as an ordinary differential equation, but the K part has to be modeled as a stochastic differential equation because everything is contingent. Those rare events change everything moving forward. They scaffold all of the conditions that follow. So in that sense, evolution relies on contingent events. You just hope that those contingencies are not so big that they destroy everything.
Great. Maybe I'll ask a quick question. We've always wanted to kind of rewind the tape of life on our planet and see if we get back to something similar. What happens in your simulations? If you rewind the tape and run it again, do you get the same distribution? Do you get the transition from Turing gas to life at the same time? How we do this?
Great question. If you run this with different random number seeds, effectively, you always get something different. You always get different programs. I've never gotten the same. The space of possible programs that can replicate is so large that the possibility of getting the same thing again is zero.
I see.
However, it's not zero. It's very, very small. However, when you look at it's both contingent and predictable. It's contingent in the sense that the programs themselves are different, the amount of computation varies, et cetera, et cetera. But it is also predictable in the sense that if you look at the distribution of times to gelation, right, that distribution follows something that looks kind of like an Erlang distribution, consistent with a certain number of steps. And the number of steps, by the way, is roughly 12 in the case of BFF. So you can say, like, this is, the statistics of this look kind of like 12 random events happening in a row.
I see.
And they have a such and such distribution, and you can do real statistical physics with that. But of course, there's random contingency as well. Okay. So I would expect life to be different, on Earth, but still have arisen and still have become intelligent and so on.
Got it. Then maybe one last question we'll take. I guess there's more. Let me get one from the Zoom because people have been waiting here. Somebody asked, given your insights on the evolution of life or intelligence, do LLMs provide a viable pathway to AGI? And if not, what else is required?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, there are a lot more details in the book about this, but briefly, Peter Norvig, who is here, and I wrote a piece in Noema years ago now, in which we assert that AGI is already here. So if by the G in artificial general intelligence we mean not N, which is what it was originally contrasted with, right? Like we were using the term AI for speech recognition and face recognition and stuff, right? The G means no, it's general. It can do an open-ended set of things. We got that the moment we began to do unsupervised sequence models, that are capable of in-context learning and so on. I think that if you took any of the frontier models today and you transported them back in time to the year 2000 or so, when that AGI-NI distinction was first made, anybody back then would be like, you've arrived.
Uh-huh.
But then they would say, so what was the big insight? How did you do it? And then we'd be like, there was actually no moment at which this happened. It was just, we just scaled it up and there are a bunch of, technical tweaks to make sure that it's scaled up correctly. And it's because of that. It's because of the fact that there has been no key insight that we haven't declared success. So having said this, there are definitely things missing from LLMs. The biggest one clearly being something like a hippocampus and an episodic memory, long-term memory. But there are a lot of teams working on that, making a lot of progress. So I don't think it's that deep. It's certainly not embodiment because we see sequence models in robotics doing amazing stuff, and I expect that to continue.
I have follow-ups to that and some disagreements, but anyways, let's maybe back there.
Hi, I was wondering what your opinion was on using maybe biological robots as a mechanism of studying symbiogenesis and the idea that cooperation is what drives evolution.
I think it's a really cool direction. So, Mike Levin is a good friend of mine, and he's been doing a lot of that sort of work at Tufts University. He's kind of a crazy dude, but he's also done some remarkable things. Like, so he's one of the things that he's most famous for in recent years is xenobots, which are cell cultures taken from xenopus frogs from the skin, and if you just take these cells and you stick them together in clumps, they coordinate and make things that look like little robots or little organisms that have all kinds of emergent behaviors. They appear to develop a sense of hearing. They grow cilia and can locomote. They can make decisions. They can even, in some sense, reproduce. They gather other cells into globs like themselves. It's pretty weird when you think about it, because these are the skin cells of the xenopus. There's no organism in evolution that has ever worked like that, and so it suggests that there is quite a bit of intelligence there at a cellular level that allows them to cooperate, to make bigger structures. And it's not just that the frog is the only thing that they know how to make, right? They have a bunch of skills, as it were, and the frog is the normal thing that those skills result in when everything kind of goes quote unquote as it should. But we forget that life occurs on many scales, and it's the intelligence of the lower scales that results in the higher scales in the first place. So yeah, I think it's a very fruitful direction, and it's one that, I'm not a biologist. We don't have that kind of equipment in our lab and so on, but I think collaborations between computer scientists and biologists are a good idea, especially given that biology ultimately is computer science, or computer science is a form of biology.
In terms of the last video that you showed, the split brain, that still the sort of subjectivity of the system was through a sort of unity and wholeness and oneness. And then the way I understood is that this system, or this sort of multiplicity of actions or functions move towards a certain purpose. But does that mean that always there is a certain unity or oneness, that all this multiplicity eventually move towards this sort of unifunctionality per se, or sort of one purpose?
I think it's about growing up together and having your fates tied. Maybe at risk of annoying us all by doing too much video, I'll show you one more video.
Okay.
This is Abby and Brittany Hensel, who are conjoined twins.
Chicago was like a realistic distance from our house, and it was easy to get there and get back in a weekend. Yeah, we thought it'd be fun to try deep dish pizza, and Erin had done on Segways before, so she wanted to try that with us. We're going to Chicago! Oh, such a good day. Yeah, we're 5 minutes late, but that's great. Wait, what time is it on our phones? We're only 6 minutes late. Oh, that's excellent.
That is good.
Well, obviously when we're driving, we're both watching the road, both checking the mirrors and stuff like that, and just making sure everything is good and good to go. And obviously we're both steering.
They didn't know we're here, they do now.
Road trip!
Hello.
We want to go to Chicago! We're so excited when we got.
So the point is, they have separate brains, separate spinal cords. Each controls one arm and one leg, right? They drive, they play sports, they compose emails. They use the pronoun I when, usually when they're doing that, but occasionally they'll disagree and then they'll use their names. And this is these are these are two people, right, who are physically fused.
Evolution has the idea of survival of the fittest. So there's always this sort of one system, even as the random as possible, one event overcome, there's a possibility or probability of that one system overcome another one, right? So how does then this, because we're talking about humans and these systems, right?
Well, remember that in the main, I mean, this is why I showed these matrices. There are both positive and negative values on the off diagonals, right? So those are, even when we're not looking at the symbiogenesis part of this, we're just looking at the part that has competition in it. It also has cooperation in it, right? So the competition is on the left, the cooperation is on the right, and they actually, there is a tendency for the cooperation to overwhelm the other parts, which is why you get those symbiogenetic transitions in the first place, why you get those runaway effects. Essentially, the more complex things get, the more they're modeling others. You can think of it as the more use they're making of others. And use breeds dependency, and dependency breeds tied fates. I think that's a way to understand it. The moment you are making full use of everybody around you, at some point you can't get by without them. And your fates become tied, and at that point it sets the grounds for a shared identity, which is how we get, companies, universities, countries, and so on. But it's also how you get people out of cells. And I don't want to attribute states of mind in the same way that we've got to individual cells, but I think it's the same process. I hope that answers the question. All right, and I guess
let's thank Blaise for a wonderful talk. Thanks.